Every class in ESO has its quirks, but only one feels like it was really built for the modern version of the game, and to no one's surprise, it happens to be the latest edition. What's up everybody, welcome back to the channel, I'm Cal. Today I wanted to share the build that I've been running on my Arcanist character, and I also wanted to talk a little bit about class balance, subclassing, and class identity in the Elder Scrolls Online. And yeah, after 5.5, almost 6 years of playing almost exclusively the Warden, I finally did it and finished building out my Arcanist. I was stubbornly sticking to the Warden class because I love it so much, working on my build and my rotation, trying to keep pace with everybody out there who is embracing Herald of the Tome and beam builds. But I finally had to give in and give it a try for myself, so I finished leveling up my Arcanist and building out the kit. I'm sure as many of you out there already know, I've been a Warden main basically since I started playing ESO over 5 years ago. It's my favorite class, and it fits my go-to fantasy archetype perfectly. I almost always play some sort of bow warden, bow hunter, whatever in every MMO that I play. Of course, I didn't really want to move away, so I tried really hard to make it work. But in modern ESO, there's Arcanists and then there's everybody else. So for today's video, I wanted to share the build that I've put together using Herald of the Tome as a base class Arcanist, talk a little bit about why I've switched over and how it feels, along with how those Arcanist DPS skills compare to older classes in ESO. I also think there's something to take away here about ESO's evolving approach to class identity and balance, and of course we'll wrap up with my Arcanist fashion design. So before we dive into the build, let's talk a little bit about why I am testing out a new character. I've been trying 4 months now to squeeze just a little bit more DPS out of my Warden build, practicing my rotation and trying out new gear combos, but I think I probably hit a ceiling, at least for my personal skill level. And it honestly started to feel like I was doing a lot of work to reach DPS numbers that were typically 20 to 30% below some of my group mates. So while I love the vibe of the Warden, and I can even appreciate that wonky rotation that I came up with for my Gravelord Warden build, I really just felt like I needed to do more. I needed to bring more damage to the table. Now, I know the ESO devs, ZeniMax, they like to say that you can play however you want in ESO, and I believe that is true up to a point. But when you're trying to consistently clear these vet trials or chasing leaderboard scores, you want to bring top tier DPS, and right now that means Arcanist, or at the very least, a Herald of the Tome build. This isn't new information. Arcanist has been sitting at the top basically since it launched, not just because it's powerful, but because it's also just so polished. The rotation is pretty convenient and easy to follow, sustain is rarely a problem on the class, and every skill in that skill line actually brings extra versatility. So these DPS skills aren't just the best DPS skills in the game, but they also grant shields, heals, and synergies for your group mates to use that other class kits just don't. So I've put together my Arcanist using mostly the meta sets that you'll see on other builds, just to see how easy it was to reach those numbers myself. The Herald of the Tome build is strong in both single target and AoE cleave, and it lets me compete on an even footing in in-game PvE, while lowering the skill required to achieve that top tier DPS from what was necessary on my Warden. So bigger numbers, more consistently, with less effort. So the build obviously centers around the Herald of the Tome skill, and it riffs on what was the meta around update 46. Some things have changed a little bit, but not enough to matter. And it still performs incredibly well. So right out of the gate, I was hitting almost 115k, up to about 120k on the parse dummy. I was outperforming my Warden's best previous parses before I'd even finished optimizing this new character. Some of my gear was still purple, I had a number of skills that weren't fully ranked up, and I was missing my Undaunted passives. For reference, that Gravelord Warden build actually lost a little bit of DPS in update 47. I think the highest I've hit since then was about 105. So we're talking about a solid 10 to 15% increase in my parse ability just by swapping to a Herald of the Tome build. And it wasn't even fully optimized yet. I know there are a few other builds out there that don't necessarily leverage the beam or even Herald of the Tome and can still hit really good parses. You know, some of this is my personal ability as well. But there's nothing that I've seen that matches the ease and consistency of a Herald of the Tome build. So for this build, I'm running dual wield on the front bar and two-handed on the back. For dual wield, it's mostly for access to quick cloak and two-handed for stampede. I'm subclassing assassination for the crit bonuses, passive sustain, and then I'm actually slotting the 3 skills that grant additional passive buffs: concealed weapon, merciless resolve, and soul harvest. Finally, I'm using Adric's spear exclusively for 2 of its passives, burning light and balanced warrior, since they boost DPS without having to slot any skills from that line. and I don't have any more room on my skill bars. And just to cover the very basics here, I went Imperial for my race, but of course race doesn't really matter. I'm using the Thief Mundus because I don't need any more crit damage. All of the armor is medium divines. The food is typically Dubious Cameron Throne or Lavafoot, Soup, and Saltress when I don't need the health buffs. Potions are just the generic tripods for now, and I've gone Bloodthirsty traits with weapon damage enchants on all of my jewelry. This is all pretty standard fare for pretty much any DPS build in ESO in 2025. So my core setup, base class Arcanist, Herald of the Tome is the one skill line I'm keeping. I'm subclassing Assassination and Adric Spear like I mentioned earlier. Now rotation-wise, this build is refreshingly simple for someone like me who is used to playing a Warden or Necro, and it's very forgiving for less experienced players. You can focus on execution and mechanics instead of staring down your ability bar trying to min-max your rotation. Now, like most DPS rotations in ESO, you've got some short duration buffs, damage over time skills, and then of course your spammables. But before you go into combat, make sure you've got your banner up. Then use Inspired Scholarship, Stampede to your target, and drop Fulminating Rune, all from the back bar. Then swap over to your front bar, where you should hit Quick Cloak first of all, and then go into your normal rotation. 2 Flails and a Fate Carver. You should be able to get at least 2 rounds of Flail plus Fate Carver in before you need to reapply Stampede and Rune from your back bar. Then back to your front bar for 2 more Flails and another Fate Carver before it's time to refresh Inspired Scholarship and Quick Cloak. When you cast Quick Cloak, you gain Major Expedition for 4 seconds, which will also buff your damage thanks to the Cavalier's Charge on your banner. So it's not a bad idea to try and line it up with your ultimate. But of course, make sure you're casting Tide King's Gaze whenever it's up. You may also want to try and sneak in 1 extra Flail or fire off a Merciless Resolve proc before you swap to your back bar. This ensures that Fate Carver has finished its channel. Swapping bars can end the channel prematurely, but casting another skill will not. And then, when that skill fires, you know you can safely bar swap. That's it. It's simple, it's static, it's reliable. You even get a little break every time you channel Fate Carver because you got 4.5 seconds to pop a potion, reposition, or just catch your breath. Again, I'm not breaking the mold here. All right, let's move on to the gear sets. So for the gear, I've gone again with a fairly standard balanced setup that is great in pretty much every scenario. For my Mythic, I'm using the Velothi Mage's Amulet. This is great on the Gravelord Warden. It's also great here. This is a build that doesn't have a lot of opportunities to light attack weave, and I'm not great at it anyway, so we may as well use the Mythic that removes the need for good light attack weaving anyway. Then for my trial set, I am using the Perfected Null Arca set. This seems to be one of the most popular nowadays, and it provided my best parse, but you could easily swap in War of the Depths, Relicans, or Ansels and probably get similar numbers. My second 5-piece set is going to be Deadly Strike. Still offers great all-around performance with a consistent damage buff for all channels and dots. For my extra piece, I am using Slimecraw, and then of course on my back bar, I'm using a Perfected Maelstrom weapon. The great sword for me, but you could go bow or staff here too. Just make sure it's infused with that weapon damage enchant. Now, that's the basics of the build, but I want to talk a little bit about class balance and identity. So after 5 years as a Warden main, it is kind of wild how far behind that class feels now. And to some extent, how far behind every class feels now when compared to Arcanists. And it raises an important question. What does play how you want really mean when in-game content is balanced around Arcanist level damage and utility? Take Ossian Cage, the new trial. That first real boss virtually demands massive cleave DPS, and it feels like it was designed with Arcanist's Herald of the Tome in mind. But even beyond just having a really strong AoE cleave, like I mentioned earlier, those skills are also bringing additional utility to the table. This is a class whose skills were designed with almost 10 years of knowledge behind them. What would make the perfect DPS skill line? And when you compare that with Warden or Necro or any of the base game classes, these are classes that have not been properly reworked or retrofitted over the years to keep up with what Arcanist is bringing to the table. They can perform well, of course, but they require more effort to get it done, more skill to play well, and in my opinion, there's no real balance between Arcanist and the rest. And this wouldn't really matter that much, except I don't really want to be limited to just Herald of the Tome builds. It's probably the biggest reason for why subclassing feels like it took away build diversity rather than adding to it. When it comes to class balance, I think there are actually a few valid ways to approach it, none of which I think are really being applied well here. For me, I think you can balance around performance data, right? Measure the DPS output and adjust skills up or down until every class can perform at a consistent level. Or 2, balance around class popularity to promote diversity, of course. I think it's generally fine to overtune underplayed, unpopular, or difficult to play classes. None of these really apply to Arcanist or Herald of the Tome. They're not underplayed, they're not unpopular, and it's not difficult to play. Or you can balance around specialization. One class happens to be the best at single target, another excels at AoE, or a third gets all the utility. For me, I think those are all valid ways to balance classes and skill lines. But what we have right now is a class that's the best at everything, and it also comes with the lowest skill floor. Herald of the Tome gives you the high single target damage, excellent cleave, built-in sustain, free buffs, shields, even self-healing, all on a static, forgiving rotation. The Warden, by comparison, feels like you're doing a lot more work just to keep up. So I started to think about it. Imagine if every Warden skill had an Arcanist-style secondary benefit. So for example, Sub-Assault also provides a shield refresh every time the shocks fire, much like Pragmatic Fate Carver does. Or Cutting Dive could return some of the damage dealt as heals, much like Flail. Betty Netch should absolutely give Major Brutality and Sorcery when slotted on either bar, just like Inspired Scholarship does. The only skill that you could maybe argue is better or comparable is the Bear Ultimate, because I think it provides better sustained DPS than Tide King's Gaze, but it requires both your ultimate slots and the bear can die in combat. There are a number of fights where its usefulness is greatly reduced as a result of that. And I'm sorry to focus so much on Warden. You could probably make the same case for Necro or any of the other classes here. It's just that Warden is the class I'm most familiar with, and I was comparing and contrasting the skill lines while I was getting used to the Arcanist. But you have to ask, why would anyone out there choose Animal Companions over Herald of the Tome? And why hasn't this been addressed in the years since the Arcanist class was introduced? Build flexibility, especially the option to play the way you want. Create any character you can imagine by mixing and matching those class skills, weapon skills, guild and world skills, as well as the armor, the role, etc. That only works when there's some semblance of balance in the game. And this isn't a single player offline RPG. This is an MMO. I'm not just playing in my own little version of Skyrim. I'm competing with other players out there for slots in veteran groups. There's leaderboards that I'd like to rank on, and achievements that seemingly require Herald of the Tome, or at the very least are far easier to unlock with a meta Arcanist build. So I know this has been a little bit of a rant and a bit of a deviation from my usual content, and it probably sounds like I'm just hating on Arcanists right now, but I don't want that to be the takeaway from this video. I don't think Arcanists necessarily need to be nerfed by any means. I would like to see class balance changes that lift everybody else up to that new design standard, so that we actually can build a competitive DPS character that's not just some version of an Arcanist. Switching gears here before I wrap up the video, since you know I can't make a video without talking about character design, and if I'm playing Arcanist, I'm going to be going full metal Arcanist. So for the head, I've got the Blind Mask, shoulders and gloves are the Shardborn Pauldrons and Gauntlets, for the chest I've used the Westfield Legion Cuirass, the belt is Crimson Oath, legs and boots are the Ayleid Lich set. And for the weapons, I actually found a good use for the Ifray Bound, just for that nice green glow that perfectly matches the Arcanist Crux and Beam. If you're not doubling down on the green, can you even call yourself an Arcanist? Now, when I'm hanging out in town, I'll push it even further by swapping over to the Spattering Disjunction set from the Infinite Archive so I can get that sweet green visual aura going on. Honestly, the set is also just fine in most content, so if you like the look, you can probably rock this in overland content and normal dungeons and all that. The debuffs are sometimes redundant, of course, but Arcanists are so good that you'll still be outclassing many other builds. For the dyes, I'm using Mora's Mauve, and I've paired it with Cold Harbor Ash Black and Shadowfoot Gray. If I have to turn to the green side, at least I'll look good doing it. And I love an excuse to use one of those color shifting dyes and a few motifs that wouldn't really fly on my nature-loving Bosmer. But it all works great for an Imperial character out of the Westfield who's a little too obsessed with Apocrypha and Athelia. So that's my Arcanist build, along with some of my thoughts on class balance and a little bit of ESO fashion. Have you made the switch to Arcanist yet? Or are you still holding the line with your main? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective on this whole situation. If you found this video useful or relatable, don't forget to like and subscribe for future ESO content. And of course, you can always join my Discord to talk more ESO or join my guild on the PCNA server. You can also find the full build linked below, along with the link to that Discord. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all in Tamriel. Bye for now, everyone.